Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about the buildings where Anglo-Saxons wove flax into linen. Properly speaking, they're called Grubenhauser, as they were first recognised by German archaeologists. English archaeologists first used a colloquial version of this, grub huts, and then settled on sunken-featured buildings, usually contracted to SFBs. Ethnographers refer to the same sort of thing, used in recent societies, as pit houses, but then have to qualify that name by saying they're not really houses, but used for storage and other activities. In recent centuries, pit houses have been used in various parts of North and South America and Japan. They were also built in many parts of Northern Europe, including Germany and England, between the 5th and 12th centuries AD. This video centres around the archaeological evidence of English ones from the 6th to about the 9th centuries. Now, such archaeological evidence can easily be missed. All that survives is a shallow sub-rectangular pit of varying depth, depending on the soil preservation of the site, and usually just a couple of post holes. Some sunken-featured buildings may always have been less than a foot deep. In plan, they're often about 6 feet by 4 feet, although ones excavated from the 1950s onward at West Stow are around 12 feet long, 9 feet wide and 2 to 3 foot deep. There's usually just one post at each end, although sometimes 4 or even 6 post holes survive. A gabled roof would have been created using the end posts. Probably there were never any windows and only one door in the end. This illustration is based on one by Mike Codd and shows a cutaway view of a sunken-featured building on what I suspect was an improbably busy day. The 1970s excavations at Weststow found evidence of charred planks from a suspended floor. Sometimes a hearth was partially located over the edge of the pit, and the hearth then collapsed when the floor supporting the overhanging section rotted or burnt. Ethnographers report that pit houses were used to store food, so a bit like root cellars, and some were also used for cultural activities such as telling stories, dancing, singing, and celebrations. The ones with a wider range of uses were most likely to have wooden floors, whereas ones for storage may or may not have had suspended floors. Excavations of Anglo-Saxon sunken-featured buildings suggest that similarly some never had a floor. But we need to be cautious, because until recent decades, archaeologists had real difficulty spotting the scant remains of sunken-featured buildings. It still isn't easy. In any event, whether there was a floor or not, the pits associated with sunken-featured buildings often ended up being filled in with domestic rubbish, especially butchery waste. In Britain and Northern Europe, the debris left in sunken-featured buildings quite often includes loom weights. Exceptionally, as at Felton in Northumbria, 60 or 70 loom weights may be found together in a line, suggesting that a loom had collapsed or been burnt down without a woven cloth being removed. Now, as loom weights are often made from baked clay, then any burn marks on them may have come from their manufacture rather than from a fire in the hut. We know that Anglo-Saxons wove wool and flax. Both require the yarn to be kept at the right humidity. A so-called root cellar under a suspended floor would be ideal for this. Presumably the yarn would be kept wrapped inside leather sacks. Both materials would be valuable, if only for the amount of time and effort needed to process them, so underfloor storage will also reduce the possibility of pilfering. And flax requires soaking in water, usually for several weeks, before it can be spun. The fabric woven from flax, known as linen, is very comfortable to wear, especially in warmer weather. When worn next to the skin, linen wicks away sweat and reduces bacterial growth that makes nasty BO. Linen dries quickly and feels a lot cooler than cotton in hot weather. Not that Anglo-Saxons had cotton. They had wool, of course, and also grew hemp and nettles as fibres. Canvas was originally made from hemp. Indeed, the word canvas is derived from the Latin cannabis. How much fabric made from hemp or nettle was actually worn is debatable. These fibres may have been woven coarsely to be used as sacks and such like. In the 14th century poem Piers Plowman, the author, William Langland, reveals that some women were assigned the coarse job of sowing sacks for the wheat, whereas wives and widows were advised to spin wool and flax. Such divisions of labour based on social status were likely to go back to Anglo-Saxon times and probably earlier. Linen is made from the stems of the flax plant. Long strands of bast fibre are hidden within the stems. In addition, flax seeds are edible or can be processed into a naturally drying oil, linseed oil. It's still favoured for varnishing wood. Flax is easy to grow in temperate northern climates, and very few pests or diseases attack the plants, although it does need plenty of well-composted manure. To get the best quality fibre, flax is harvested just before the flowers have finished, but before the seeds have formed. If you wait for the seeds to form, then the fibre quality is impaired. Flax is harvested by pulling up the roots, then tying them to sheaves and stacking them in stooks to dry. Once dry, the flax sheaves are rippled, in other words, the seeds are removed. Then the sheaves are stored somewhere dry. They can be stored for several years and before the next step, or they can be processed right away. The outside of the stem needs to be removed. The technical name is decorticated, to reveal the bast fibre running the length of the stem. The process is known as retting. Retting is a controlled rot which breaks down the hard stem of the flax, so the unwanted parts can be separated from the bast fibres. It involves submerging the flax in water, or laying it on short grass and allowing the dew to do its thing. Soaking flax in water is, shall we say, not very good for the watercourse downstream, and I'm reliably informed it stinks. Retting using dew is said to produce a finer, lighter colour fibre and make better cloth. Retting time is quite variable, as it depends on temperature, humidity, thickness of the stem, and other factors. According to experienced linen weavers, it's best to ret flax in small batches and to stop early. You can always re-ret flax, but you can't unret it. Once retted, it is again tied into sheaves and dried in stooks before storing. It can be stored in a dry place for many years or decades before processing into spinnable fibre. Before the fibres can be spun, it needs to be scutched, beating every inch in a specific manner. The scutched fibres are then hackled, a specific way of combing out unwanted material. Scutching, hackling and spinning are all labour intensive, and that's before the yarn is dyed and hand-woven into cloth. Flax must be wet to be spun, which would make the earth pit in sunken-featured buildings an ideal storage space for the scutched and hackled fibre. Now, while a lot of people weave wool on warp-weighted looms, few work with flax. So far as I'm aware, there's been no experimental archaeology involving experienced flax weavers attempting to ply their skills, assisted only by the earth pit in a sunken-featured building. If anyone does know of such experiments, then please email me. My address is in the description below. As far as we can tell from surviving literature, all Anglo-Saxon textile preparation was done by women, no doubt assisted by children. Inevitably the women would have worked together, either sharing a specific task or working simultaneously on similar tasks. So, were the sunken-featured buildings used only as weaving huts? Probably not, as the earth pit allowed optimum storage of root vegetables and such like. But these buildings were most likely female spaces. Wow. Now, I'm well aware that Western society has developed an aversion to gender-specific spaces. And since the 1960s, there has been a trend in academe to avoid simplistic dualisms and other so-called structural analyses. But Anglo-Saxons were not part of modern Western society, still less late 20th century academe. To understand Anglo-Saxons, you need to think like an Anglo-Saxon, as I've discussed in a previous video called the G.K. Chesterton School of Anglo-Saxon History. Thinking like an Anglo-Saxon allows for a wide range of possibilities. But whatever Anglo-Saxons were or were not, they weren't post-structuralists. Neither were any number of traditional societies around the world, which ethnographers have revealed to have women-only huts. These huts were places for handicrafts, storytelling, singing, and such like, and also for birthing and associated midwifery, and sometimes though not always, the places women lived while menstruating. Thanks to Michael Enright's wonderful book, Lady with a Mead Cup, we have insights into the roles of women in early medieval Germanic societies, well, at least the more elite women. Professor Enright offers no insight into Germanic or Anglo-Saxon weaving, but Christine Fell and Karen Bek-Pedersen, among other scholars, have done, and they consider that sunken-featured buildings were used for flax weaving. Furthermore, some of the surviving Anglo-Saxon charms reveal that flax was emblematic of women. Presumably, seeing women preparing and weaving flax was very much an everyday experience. In case you're wondering, the corresponding emblem for men was the leek, with its potent smell and rather, shall we say, Freudian shape. It's the reason why daffodils are the national symbol for Wales, as in Welsh the flowers are called Cenhynnin Bydda, Peter's leek, even though daffodils are actually related to amaryllis rather than alliums. Is there any evidence for Anglo-Saxon sunken-featured buildings, more multifunctional women's spaces? Well, yes, although the evidence was almost missed. In the mid-1990s, about 50 Anglo-Saxon post-built and sunken-featured buildings were excavated at Kettleby near Melton Mowbray. In the fill of 2 of the sunken-featured buildings, the remains of 2 children were discovered. They had died at the time of birth or within 1 month. The deposition of human remains in sunken-featured buildings had previously been noted at other Anglo-Saxon settlements. Often, though by no means always, these remains are of children. And this is in contrast with Anglo-Saxon cemeteries of the same time frame, where children are conspicuously underrepresented. Attempting to make a broader assessment of child burials in Anglo-Saxon sunken-featured buildings is currently difficult. Yes, major Anglo-Saxon settlements have been excavated, but, as at Mucking and Catholm, the soil conditions were not conducive to bone survival. And there's a massive bone assemblage from West Heselton, but that is yet to be fully assessed. Only at West Stow is there anything comparable to Kettleby. However, West Stow was mostly excavated in the 1950s and 1970s, and archaeological practices have become more sophisticated since then. For example, only one of the 2 neonatal burials at Kettleby was recognised at the time of excavation. The remains of the other child were only identified during post-excavation analysis of what was thought to be a collection of animal bones. We simply don't know how many other neonatal burials, tricky to identify at the best of times, have simply been missed. Nevertheless, a study by Helena Hamerow, published in 2006, identified 42 human remains from 16 Anglo-Saxon settlement sites. A third of those were infants, and most of these burials were in sunken-featured buildings. Based on ethnographical parallels, we can reasonably conclude that neonatal and infant deaths were followed by burial under the floor of a birthing hut. By the way, just because the archaeologists recovered a neonatal burial from a diverse collection of animal bone does not mean the infant was thrown away with the rubbish. Most probably the infant was carefully buried, and the animal waste only added to the pit a considerable time later. But the nature of taphonomic processes, and for instance Charles Darwin was the first to recognise the dramatic effect of earthworms, led to the very fragile child's remains being conflated with the other bones. The archaeological evidence from Anglo-Saxon sunken-featured buildings, such as loom weights, confirms that they were often used as weaving huts. The association with neonatal and infant burials suggests, but does not prove, that they could also have been birthing huts and similar women-only spaces. The well-documented gender divide in Germanic cultures, which gave elite women almost the same status as elite males, suggests that sunken-featured buildings may have been the female counterparts to the male-dominated feasting halls with their more substantial post-built construction. But as the title of this video indicates, I can only offer a few clues as to whether Anglo-Saxon weaving huts were women-only places, without being able to offer a definitive answer.